On May the 5th, the spy agency of the Republic of Korea became the first in Asia to join a cyber defense institution under the NATO that's based in Estonia, known as the CCDCOE. The news came as NATO has stepped up collusion with the ROK and Japan, vowing to quote-unquote stand together with its Asia-Pacific partners to protect their values. China is asking, after messing up Europe, is now NATO trying to mess up the Asia-Pacific and the world? So what does NATO extending its claws eastward towards the Asia-Pacific mean for China and the region? How should countries in the region respond? I'm pleased to be joined during this special edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin, from Nicaragua by Benjamin Norton, who is founder and editor of the independent news website Multipolarista, and by Professor Wang Jiangyu from the School of Law of the City University from Hong Kong. Gentlemen, welcome to The Point. Let me get to Mr. Norton first. As I said, the Republic of Korea's intelligence agency, the National Intelligence Service, has been accepted as a representative of the country to join the NATO Cyber Defense Unit. They put forward this application in 2019. And in April, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said that NATO and our Asia-Pacific partners have now agreed to step up our practical and political cooperation in several areas, including cyber, new technology, and countering disinformation. So can we conclude, Mr. Norton, that the ROK's inclusion in the cyber institution is a message from NATO of a closer cooperation against China?
Yes, clearly. We've seen numerous statements from Jens Stoltenberg and other members of NATO that the goal of NATO is actually changing, and not only is it countering Russia, it is also aimed at encircling militarily China. We've seen that the US government, the US military, is spending tens of billions of dollars over the next 6 years to fill the first island chains with missiles aimed at China. And we see that just as NATO has encircled Russia militarily, the goal for the United States is now to encircle China militarily. And this goal actually predates the Russian military intervention in Ukraine this February. We saw that last year in 2021, NATO held its annual meeting, and it released a statement that was very hawkish, very aggressive against China, threatening China. And now we've seen that the US-led military alliance, we should keep in mind that NATO is led by the United States, that it is now pressuring Korea, South Korea that is, and Japan to basically effectively militarily merge. And we should not forget, it's very important to keep in mind that the US military still has tens of thousands of troops in both Japan and South Korea. It has 55,000 troops roughly in Japan. And those troops are in many cases not wanted, as we've seen in massive protests, especially in the case of Okinawa. And we've also seen large protests against the 28,000 US troops who are still in South Korea. And this is not necessarily a new policy. Ronald Reagan back in the 1980s declared South Korea and Japan to be major non-NATO allies. But what we're seeing is that the so-called North Atlantic Treaty Organization not only is expanding into Eastern Europe, but it's expanding even into East Asia, which is, of course, very far from the North Atlantic region.
Professor Wang, how do you see the messages coming out of both NATO about reaching out eastward to Northeast Asia, to East Asia, let's say, and the ROK and Japan, the authorities there, showing, despite local oppositions, showing a step up of willingness and interest in collaborating with NATO on a military security sense?
I think from Japan's and from Japanese and the Korean perspective, these are two so in international relations we call partial independent states. So their military and diplomacy to a very large extent are controlled by the US. So they already have a very strong military alliance with the alliance relationship with the US. And in that sense, it is actually not very much necessary for NATO to reach out to Asia, because that the US actually has the even stronger security infrastructure available to it. But now the situation has changed very much because Russia's war on Ukraine. And now from Japanese and Korean perspective, they probably believe that they can make use of the resources in NATO, including the cyber defense capabilities, cyber defense resources in the CCDCOE. But the US is very much like to see this development because although it's not necessarily true that the US wants to expand or push for the expansion of NATO in Asia, but I think it's in the US interest. And also it is very much probably the desire of the US to establish kind of the Asian version of NATO. So that is why you see now you see formal institutional linkages being established between some Asian states, including Japan and Korea, and NATO. So the Korea's accession to the CCDCOE is only a minor step, but the question is, it is symbolically very, very significant because it indicates a trend that the US is trying to establish a global security infrastructure under its own leadership and for its interest.
Mr. Norton, do you see this as beginning of a trend of closer military cooperation between NATO with countries in Eastern Asia and Northeastern Asia? Or is there a relationship between the US's military alliance or cooperation with the ROK and Japan, which had already been there, and now the step-up cooperation between NATO, which is more or less based in Europe, although it's led by the United States? Do you see a stepped-up willingness and activity on the part of European military leaders to step up security cooperation with countries such as Japan and the ROK?
Well, we will see what European militaries do. Of course, many European militaries are quite weak because largely NATO has served as their security umbrella, and led by the US military, many of these European militaries have been systematically underfunded. And, you know, as the other guest said, basically semi-independent states with much of their foreign policy dictated from Washington. So we'll see what happens. I mean, there is an attempt now by European states to remilitarize, citing the Russian military intervention in Ukraine. But we should keep in mind that European foreign policy still very much follows the diktats of Washington's foreign policy. Now, in terms of military collaboration, of course, the US has kept troops in Japan since 1945 and has had troops in South Korea since the 1950s. Those troops they've never left. What Washington is trying to do by trying to integrate these Eastern European allies into a NATO architecture is I think not only military in nature, but political. And unfortunately, in Washington, we've seen a turn toward Cold War rhetoric. And in 2018, the Pentagon published a national defense strategy, which declared China and Russia to be the major so-called threats to the United States, effectively saying that the so-called war on terror was over. And the US military withdrawal from Afghanistan in August 2021, I think, marked the end of the so-called war on terror. And the US has instead turned toward a new Cold War. And Joe Biden himself has said very clearly that the US goal is regime change in Moscow, overthrowing the Russian government. And we've seen that the US has had very aggressive policy against Beijing as well. And clearly the US has hinted that it wants regime change against the Chinese government. So I think what the US is trying to do here politically, as well as militarily, is trying to bring its Eastern European allies into a larger umbrella with Europe and try to unite these forces together against both Russia and China. Now, of course, in Europe, a lot of countries want to have better relations with China. They understand that China offers a lot of trade possibilities and infrastructure opportunities. Some European countries are part of the Belt and Road Initiative. They see Russia as their main strategic concern. And in East Asia, these US-backed countries like in Japan and South Korea see China as their concern. So what the US is trying to do is trying to bring both of these forces together and unite them against both China and Russia under the US-led new Cold War.
Let's take a look at the action from the sides of the ROK and Japan from their government perspective. We have seen unprecedented moves. For instance, the foreign ministers of Japan and the ROK joint NATO foreign ministers meeting in April. This was the very first time in history. And then we also have on May the 5th, the prime ministers of Japan and the UK met in London, where both sides agreed, according to their official readout, that security in the Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific regions was indivisible, and that G7 leaders said democracies around the world needed to stand in unity against authoritarian regimes. Now, both ROK and Japan have been invited to participate in the next NATO summit in June to be held in Madrid, Spain, although Japanese authorities have said that it's not decided whether to attend or not, and the ROK is also saying that it has not made up its mind yet. Professor Wang, what do you say are the factors that are driving these two sides ever closer, at least apparently?
Well, as I said before, the first, they are very much encouraged by the US to move closer to NATO, because these are two countries whose military defense policy are very much controlled by the US. There's also the second reason, because now we are at the stage, probably not yet a Cold War, but we have a value war. So the US is trying to establish a narrative that there is a fighting between democratic states and authoritarian states. And so you have a lot of countries now follow that rhetoric, and they are trying to reshape their foreign policy towards that direction. So we have to closely watch the new Korean president, because he has made it clear that Korea will follow a value-based foreign policy. But the question is, these are both Asian countries and East Asian countries. So their foreign policy they also under a lot of constraints. They are very difficult circumstances for them to change the track, because they have very strong trade and investment relationship with China, and China is their neighbor, and they also need the Chinese cooperation on a lot of issues, especially on North Korea. So what they can do, they might want to do a lot of things, but in the end, what they can do would be very limited.
The NATO side, however, does have their narrative to back up their decision and their plan. For instance, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said that NATO will, for the first time, consider China in its new defense strategy, which will be finalized in June in the summit in Madrid. He called China's unwillingness to condemn Russia's aggression and joining Moscow in questioning the right of nations to choose their own path a serious challenge to us all, I guess, to Western countries as a whole. Mr. Norton, how do you see his logic? For instance, if you look at the kind of condemnation that he was referring to, if you use the General Assembly, the United Nations General Assembly vote as a barometer, you would see that the great majority of countries did not condemn Russia. They deplored in the strongest possible sense, but they did not condemn, and 35 countries, which make up, together with the countries that voted against, 35 countries abstained in the voting, and these 40 also countries account for 60% of the world's population.
That's right. I mean, it's so important to stress this point. More than 2/3 of the global population live in countries that either voted against the resolution or abstained. So we should understand, again, this is part of Washington's overall diplomatic and political strategy, which is to create a unified bloc to have confrontation against Russia and China. It is very much a Cold War mentality. That's why the US organizes these so-called conferences for democracy and refuses to invite its political adversaries, well, and also inviting countries that actually have authoritarian governments. So the US says that it's fighting for democracy. It's not about democracy, actually. That's the political window dressing, the marketing that it uses to try to sell this very provocative Cold War mentality that the US is waging right now. And when we look at the votes, not only in the United Nations, but if we also look at the refusal of countries to impose sanctions, we see an even larger block of countries around the world, especially in the global South, in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, they have refused to join this very aggressive campaign by the United States and Europe to wage economic warfare against Russia. In fact, the French finance minister said very clearly that Europe is waging an economic war against Moscow. Of course, that economic war does not distinguish the Russian government from the Russian people. We're talking about collective punishment of more than 100 million people in Russia. And this has severe consequences for the entire planet. We should keep in mind that Japan and South Korea joined in this economic war against Russia by imposing sanctions, which is also going to hurt their own economies, which are reliant on energy imports. So I think we see once again that this reflects this Cold War mentality in which Washington is trying to effectively strong arm countries around the world by using a strategy of the carrot and the stick. So sometimes trying to encourage its allies with potential economic agreements, but also threatening countries to join in this alliance that it's trying to create against both China and Russia.
If I may add something here, yes. Regarding NATO's logic, I think what he was trying to say is to very much justify the very existence of NATO. NATO was a Cold War organization. It was the military alliance. It was actually a killing machine. And after the Cold War, NATO already lost its very objective. So in order to justify its own existence, it must create enemies. And now China and Russia are seen as such enemies. So I think the logic that every independent state, every sovereign state has the right to pursue its own security path, that is very much true. But we also have to look at the flip side of the story, because you cannot do that without paying any attention to the security concern of other nations. NATO as a security organization. So I'm not saying that countries don't have the right to join NATO or any other military organization, but the NATO itself, as a military organization, has to take into consideration the global security situation and also the country's security needs. And the NATO shouldn't offer a membership to the two countries, which might cause, might disrupt peace. So these are two separate issues.
It seems that they have yet to learn from the consequences of their past actions by, stepping up their presence and their collaboration here in Northeast Asia. And China has responded, of course, very strongly. That NATO has messed up Europe. Is it now trying to mess up the Asia Pacific and even the world? Professor Wang, what would be the responses from China, the rational, measured, and yet right responses from China to the continuous trend that we're observing as the beginning, at least?
I think China is sending out a clear and explicit message that it absolutely will not accept an Asian version of NATO or NATO's expansion into Asia. So so this is very much a warning. And if it happens, so you have the Asian version of NATO or something else, then it's very likely that China will do something to counterbalance this. And there's actually China actually has a lot of bargaining chips there. So because China, if you push China to the corner, then China alone probably could change the balance of power, the security balance of power in Asia, and that will not be good, not be beneficial for everyone. So let's hope that wouldn't happen. So you will have the Asian version of NATO or NATO's expansion into Asia.
At this moment, we don't seem to see the kind of rationality that's needed on the part of NATO or NATO members. For instance, the UK's Foreign Secretary Liz Truss recently said, and to the great astonishment of many here in China, and of course resentment as well, she said, we need to preempt threats in the Indo-Pacific, and we must ensure that democracies like Taiwan are able to defend themselves Mr. Norton, finally, do you think she really knows what she's talking about? What in the world is the business of the UK to come all the way and tell China what should be done vis-a-vis the issue of Taiwan? Because China has been trying, with maximum efforts to achieve peaceful reunification. But the way how she said it, and of course not just this sentence, but other things she said, for instance, China's rise may not be inevitable, blah blah. Do you think that she really knows what she's talking about?
No, and the very aggressive posturing of people like Liz Truss and their very condescending rhetoric, I think it reflects the kind of colonial mentality of many of these Western politicians. Let's not forget Britain's role in colonizing China historically. And they still, in many ways, these Western colonialist powers, they see China and other parts of the global South as countries that are inferior to them. We see this very racist rhetoric, and it's reflected in their foreign policy. Let's not forget also that the United States has been sending military forces to Taiwan, which is part of the People's Republic of China. And we've seen that the US has continued to encourage extremist secessionist movements in China and also in Russia. This is a very cynical strategy, and it's a strategy that it can only lead to more violence and confrontation. So while the Western powers claim that they don't want to have violence, they claim that they want peace, not only are they militarizing the war in Ukraine further by sending tens of billions of dollars of weapons, they're effectively militarizing the Pacific region in East Asia. I mentioned at the beginning of this discussion how we need to really keep in mind how important this is. The US government, the US military is spending more than $20 billion to surround China with missiles on the first island chain. That is not a policy for peace. That is a policy for confrontation and potentially even war. And threatening the People's Republic of China by trying to encourage violent secessionist movements is a policy that no one in the world would tolerate. No country in the world should and could tolerate a foreign power encouraging violent secessionist movements inside their territory.
It is, I do want to mention here, because the UK or the US, the US-led West always talks about China must respect international rules, the rule-based international order. But look, the territory of Taiwan is not recognized by any international organization. It is not recognized by the United Nations as a sovereign state. So by basically, emboldening the secessionist tendencies, forces in Taiwan, they themselves, aren't they breaking international norms and rules, Professor Wang?
I think you're definitely right in pointing out that Taiwan is not being recognized as a state in major international organizations and by the majority of the states. So we don't have to be very serious about what Liz Truss has said, because the UK has a very special agenda here. The UK has left the European Union politically and economically. It's no longer a member of the European Union. So the UK sees that there's only one area it can play a role, that is diplomacy and military, for diplomacy and military policy. So it's trying to make a voice, to make itself heard, and to make the world pay attention to it. But what the UK can do is very much limited, because so far it has been only doing one thing, closely following the American line. That's the only thing it does. So we don't have to be very serious about it. And the Taiwan situation is definitely very different from Ukraine, because what she said was very much motivated by the Russian-Ukraine war. But the Taiwan situation is very different from what is Ukraine, because, as I said, Taiwan is regarded internationally as a part of China. So what we have here is not a nation-to-nation, state-to-state relationship. It is very much a continuation of the civil war.
All right. Finally, Mr. Norton, what do you think countries in Asia, what do you think China should do in reaction to such trends?
Well, it's difficult for me to say that. I don't want to lecture people in other countries how they should deal with these concerns. But I think, you know, China is a very diplomatic country. Its diplomats are very professional. They understand international law, and they have been correctly, I think, criticizing the US government's attempt to try to replace international law with this idea of the so-called rules-based international order, in which, of course, the United States makes the rules and it orders people around. The reality is that there is a set of established norms in international law that is very clearly codified. And China, the People's Republic of China, and also Russia, by the way, their diplomats continuously stress the importance in defending that international law, defending the Charter of the United Nations. And we see that the People's Republic of China has always defended territorial integrity and non-intervention in other countries' affairs. And we see that the US and NATO have violated territorial integrity and meddled in the internal affairs of dozens of countries. I mean, NATO waged a war that destroyed the country of Yugoslavia, which no longer exists as a country, and of course bombed the Chinese embassy. And NATO also waged a war that destroyed the central government of Libya in 2011. Today, 11 years later, there still is no central unified government in Libya. And I mentioned, you know, the US government's support for extremist secessionist movements in China. This is not even necessarily new. We know that the CIA spent many billions of dollars over decades supporting violent secessionist groups in Tibet. We know that the US government has supported extremist secessionist forces in Xinjiang. So the reality is that the US is the one repeatedly violating international law, and China, I think, correctly understands the importance of defending international law against these attacks by Washington.
All right, we have to leave it there. Many thanks to Benjamin Norton, founder and editor of Multipolarista, an independent news outlet, joining us from Managua, Nicaragua, and from Hong Kong, Professor Wang Jianyu from the School of Law at the City University of Hong Kong. And with that, we wrap up this special edition of The Point with me, Yu Xin, coming to you from Beijing. As usual, you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle Yu Xin in Beijing. Thanks for watching on behalf of the whole team, and we've got The Point.